Hello and good day, everyone. My name is Dr. Noel Laksamana. I'm currently the chair of the Department of Family and Community Medicine of the Bataan General Hospital and Medical Center in the city of Balanga, Bataan. And I am tasked to discuss to you as part of the review series for the board, specialty board exams in family medicine, disaster preparedness and disaster medicine for family physicians. So our objective for today is for you, the participants, would be able to, one, recognize the different hazards affecting our practice, either natural or man-made hazards. Number two is to learn about the disaster risk reduction, our approach in DRR, and how to apply it in our practice. Number three is to learn the concepts on Incident Command System, or the ICS. And lastly is to understand our role as family physicians in preparation for the big one. So this would be the movement of the West Valley Fault. So to begin with, these are the terminologies that are commonly used in disaster risk reduction. First, a disaster would mean that there is a serious disruption in terms of the functionality of a society, causing human, material, economic, or environmental losses exceeding the capability of that affected community or society to cope using its own resources. As opposed to your hazard is any phenomenon that has the potential to cause disruption or damage to people and their environment. So we go first with your types of disasters. One would be your natural disaster. They may include the following: meteorological, for example, the occurrence of hurricanes, tornado, blizzard, heat and cold wave. But for the Philippines, mainly it's mostly monsoon and typhoons. No? For geological, this would include earthquakes, movement of the or shaking of the ground, volcanic eruptions, as well as the occurrence of flood. Others would include wildfires, explosion, and disease outbreak, which we are currently on a pandemic. Other types of disasters would be accidental. This would include motor vehicular accidents resulting in mass casualties. For example, that would accidents involving vehicles such as buses, airplanes, bus, trains, and even multiple vehicular incidents. Transportation accidents resulting in hazardous materials release. Structural accidents such as collapse of a building or a bridge. And agricultural or industrial accidents, let's say a hazardous chemical or a biological exposure, either in schools, in universities, or even in the workplaces. You also have radiological accidents. These would include healthcare sources of radiation, including cobalt, cesium, and technetium, and radiation safety in diagnostic radiology and radiologic oncology settings. We have, in terms of protection, we have engineering controls as well as the wearing of your personal protective equipment for these healthcare workers to protect themselves against radiation. Another would be your intentional or violent. These are criminal acts in which the focus of the act is your victims in terms of bombing and shooting. Shooting, they may consider in hospital and clinic scenarios, the security may be compromised, such as active shooter events. Shooting is mainly for a couple of individuals, but when you're now talking about intentional or violent in terms of terrorism, the focus here is your society. So there are a lot, a potential of victims in which their number would be in terms of um, massive massive numbers. No? For example, like in bombings, in shootings, nuclear or radiological attacks, and even biological attacks. No? For they can be divided into bacteria such as anthrax, cholera, plague, and tularemia, viruses, no, smallpox, hantavirus, severe acute respiratory syndrome, your pandemic influenza, and other viral hemorrhagic fevers. For toxins, these would include botulinum and staph enterotoxin B. Chemical agents involved in acts of terrorism. That the one they've used before is sarin and other organophosphates, including pesticides and insecticides, blister agents, precursors, choking agents, also blood agents, and riot control agents, as well as other agents used in the industry. So, as a summary, these are just types and how do we classify your disasters, either according to natural accidents or intentional acts of violence. So, these would just give you an overview and to classify them according to the types of disasters. Well, in terms of our curriculum for the family medicine residency training, we're not, well, it depends upon the institution in terms of the capability as well as the competency to deliver um, these knowledge, skills, and attitude, no, to the family medicine residents. But for this one, I came about from, I got from, yeah, this was from Family Medicine, published in US. They actually classify them according to knowledge, to patient care, and to systems based practice. Well, in terms of knowledge, the following are must know in terms of providing safety in disaster responses, including wearing correctly your PPE, how to go about in terms of decontamination for poisoning cases, and even site security. As for patient care, we all know for a fact that family medicine or in family practice, we are adept in terms of triaging, not only in the outpatient department, but also some of our residents are trained in triage at the emergency room. No? So, but this one, it's a different type of triage. This one in a disaster setting. No? The clinical competence, yes, is to provide effective care when you have limited resources. In terms of systems based, that is where your incident command system would come in and how to apply in terms of planning, coordination, and execution of your disaster responses, as well as the provision of your psychological first aid for the DOH hospitals. This is where the MHPSS would come in, that your mental health and psychosocial services, as well as caring for the responders also. So this one is a graph from Doroteo in 2015, showing the disaster risk profile of the Philippines. 51% majority are storms, typhoons, and monsoon rains. That would brought about 32% of your flood, followed by 6% of landslide, volcano about 5%, earthquake 4%. So majority are related to storms and floods, no, in the Philippines. So continuing with your definition of terms, for the risk, in disaster risk reduction, this is the probability of your expected losses resulting from interaction between your natural hazard or your human induced hazards and your vulnerabilities. Your vulnerability, that's the degree to which a population or individual is unable to anticipate, cope with, or resist and recover from the impact of your disaster. So I'm showing here the map of or a blueprint of our hospital wherein the largest of the um, circle in red um, is your emergency room. Then you try to do a hospital or a hazard map and try to determine if those areas in your hospital have the following hazards. For the ER, well, most in the pre-COVID era, most of your hazards can happen, no? At the ER. Fire, earthquakes, you can receive casualties as or victims of outbreaks, typhoons, mass actions, and even poisoning. So they are all or can happen at the emergency room. And you try to also identify other parts of the hospital wherein they may have certain vulnerabilities also in terms of structural integrity. So you try to look, inspect, identify if the structural integrity of the hospital can withstand your natural hazards. As for the clinic, you can also do this one. Um, Try to map out your clinic. Is your clinic located on the ground floor? Are you prone to flooding? Does your clinic have some chemicals? Is it adjacent to a certain laboratory wherein chemicals would be present? Are there other probably chemical agents that are available in your clinic and must be out of reach from pediatric patients or children in the clinic? Or is your clinic, let's say, or the materials are very light and probably can catch fire, no, in the future? Or are you sitting in one of the areas wherein you have a fault nearby, no? So where you're in vulnerable uh, um, for damages caused by your earthquake. So moving on, so how about disaster risk reduction? These are designed to prevent the hazards from creating risks or to lessen the distribution, intensity, as well as severity of your hazards. So you can do vulnerability reduction measures such as awareness raising, improving community health security, and relocation or protection of your vulnerable populations or even structures. No? So in a way, you're creating some programs or some kind of an infrastructure to prevent these populations coming into contact with your identified hazards. As for emergency preparedness, these are long-term activities wherein they are to strengthen the capability of a community to manage efficiently all types of emergencies, thereby bring about an orderly transition from relief through recovery and back to your sustained development. So these are emergency plans develop personnel at all levels, sectors to be trained, and communities at risk to be educated. And they would also be needed to be monitored and evaluated regularly. So we first introduce your disaster risk reduction or DRR for family physicians. As I've looked through the net, I came about um, an article by a policy by the International Federation of Medical Students. No? So this was in 2017, developed in Tanzania. So what is their statement or their policy statement or their position? So your disaster risk reduction includes prevention, preparedness, response, as well as recovery efforts. Prevention and preparedness would involve conducting your disaster drills, as well as capacitating your staff in terms of basic life support, in terms of hands-only CPR, and even further um, train them on advanced cardiac life support, on pediatric advanced life support, on advanced trauma life support. No? And these trainings to capacity and for them to be eligible to become responders. Responders, so they would enter now into your response phase. Your recovery then would be more for um, crafting and implementing your business continuity plan. No? Your business continuity plan. Okay, so in this position, various stakeholders, governments, NGOs, other health sectors, they would include your health professionals as well as your medical students. So they would call upon the med students, the knowledge and skills on disaster risk management. So as we can see here, they're now teaching it on the level of the medicine student. So most of our senior residents here, well, there is it's not probably not yet discussed during your um, foundations or in basic medical education. But if these were discussed, then you're very fortunate enough to know these principles now. And yet, in IFMSA, they're trying to push these competencies for the medical students. So what more for the senior residents? As well as to provide reliable public health information during emergencies, how to adapt your community-based health approaches in terms of disaster preparedness and health emergency management, and develop plans for emergency preparedness, for the health facilities, even for the communities which are adapted by our different um, training institutions, as well as to incorporate disaster med and health emergency management in the medical curriculum. So what would be the basis of your the practice of disaster preparedness or disaster medicine? One would be, it started off with the Hyogo framework for action. This was way back in 2005. It's a 10-year plan. The goal there was to make the world safer from the natural hazards. It was a plan for about 10 years. It's the first global instrument for raising public awareness, generating political commitment, and involving your different stakeholders for this action to be implemented. This was followed by your Sendai framework for DRR. In a way, so after 2015, they yet again committed, the member nations committed a 15-year voluntary non-binding agreement. This one, or rather this time, that They've identified that the state has a primary role to reduce disaster risk, and the responsibility should be shared with other stakeholders. So we are now in your Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. So these are the different priorities for action. You should understand your disaster risk, strengthen your disaster risk governance to manage your disaster risk. That's the reason why in the Philippines, as you if you're aware that when a disaster would happen in a certain locality or community, the Office of the Civil Defense would come in, because the Office of the Civil Defense is, in a way, guides your national disaster risk reduction um, management council. No? But then there are um, groups, or these are further delegated to your local government. That's the reason why we have your provincial disaster risk reduction and even your municipal disaster risk reduction. So in a way, it's on for the um, organogram for the Philippines. It's mainly the Department of National Defense at the top, followed by the Office of the Civil Defense, and then your National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council. Number three is to invest disaster risk reduction for resilience. And lastly is to have an effective response and to build back better in terms of applying your business continuity plan, in terms of for these people to regain back their way of living, no, as well as regain their in terms of how they are um, how they are um, okay, how they are going to resume their livelihood, no, for them to become financially capable again. So how do we now integrate your disasters reduction in our own practice? This time, the American Academy of Family Physicians, they have actually a curriculum guideline, no, for the residents in specifically for disaster medicine. So this would be the nearest curriculum in terms of our practice, because it was endorsed by your AAFP. So what is the AAFP expecting for an FM resident? No, in terms of competencies, at least basic knowledge of your ICS. No? Later on, we'll discuss what your incident command system is all about. To provide public health education, no, on personal PFC preparedness, personal, family, and community preparedness, familiarity with the hazards of your facility, of your hospital, of your clinic, no, and the role of family med when disaster events would occur. Understand the principles of triage. It's a bit different for the triage at the outpatient and the emergency room. So for in terms of disaster, we have a separate triage system. Clinical competence to provide effective care in a setting of extremely limited resources, as well as to provide your psychological first aid and how to care for your responders. So that's for knowledge. How about for attitudes and behaviors? As residents or as family physicians, we are expected to, in terms of understanding the need to be prepared for disasters. So we have to be prepared to be recalled at any time a disaster would happen. Importance of good leadership and followership during the time of crisis, because not all of us for most of these disasters, the incident commander would depend on um, the the training that the incident commander has had. No, um, because there's a training on your incident command system, and there are different levels in terms of mastery of your incident command system. Next is to understand the value of excellent communication skills in times of crisis and being resourceful when you don't have a lot of your logistics for you to respond in the disaster. So we are expected to know now the knowledge on the following: type of disasters, response, care of acute injuries, what to bring, coordination of response using your incident command system or hospital incident command system, how to go about in terms of your response, and how to carry out your triaging if you've been tasked to do triaging, as well as to determine what type of PPE you're going to use for a certain type of a disaster. So when you go to this website, you can actually download these free IEC materials in terms of personal preparedness, community practice preparedness, and even recovery. So these are just additional information and handouts for you in terms of disaster preparedness. So yes, we now go to your triaging in a pre-hospital setting. So this would be from the Department of Health, Health Emergency Management Bureau from 2011. So basically, you have colors designated. You have your green, um, are all considered as walking wounded. No, so these people are they need in terms of they need the least um, in terms of interventions. No, it means that they can wait. No, before complications would set in. Our priority is for to provide care immediately for those who are tagged as red, followed by yellow. Last would be your green, and eventually last or the least to be um, extricated from a disaster would be those tagged as black. No? So as you can see here from the triage in a mass casualty setting, so how do you separate your green? So in a mass casualty setting, you can just stand and just shout. You can say that all those who can hear me or can hear my voice, you can approach me, and then you can assist those um, victims who are all walking or they can walk by themselves, and they are those who are tagged as green. And then if you already have your personal protective equipment and you were given a go signal by your operation section chief to do your triaging, so you start off with your respiration. It's a bit different from approaching a patient and saying, hey, are you okay? So it's different, no? Because we're trying to um, get uh, we're trying to provide care as immediate as possible and to increase the number of survivors in a mass casualty incident. So you do first your respiration upon approaching a patient. So what you can do is to, if the patient is not breathing, you try to position your airway You can do your modified jaw thrust or your modified jaw head thrust or your modified jaw thrust or your head or even your head tilt chin lift. You do your head tilt chin lift if you're entertaining that there is no cervical spine injury. But when you are entertaining a cervical spine injury, you do your modified jaw thrust. So once you position that airway, if the patient has evidence of spontaneous breathing, you immediately tag it as red. But if you position the airway and the patient did not breathe at all, you can now tag it as black, and the patient is now dead and can be tagged as black. So, however, if you have patient who has spontaneous breathing, if he or she is tachypnic at 30 cycles per minute, no, immediately tag it as red. But if the patient is not in respiratory distress, you check for your perfusion or your circulation. What you can do is check for your radial pulse. If the pulse is absent, you try to look for signs of bleeding, no, visible signs of bleeding. You control that. You do your packing and stop the bleed and tag this as red. Or you can proceed to your capillary refill time. If it's prolonged more than 2 seconds, your CRT, there is a bleeding, you can control that and tag this as red. But if you have a patient who is breathing not really fast and you have a pulse which is present, you now check for your mental status. Um, and you can provide some directions. You can ask the patient's name or so what you can do there if the patient is somewhat confused, cannot follow the single command, you tag this as red. But if the patient can follow single command, however he or she is not ambulatory, you can tag this as yellow. So we are using it. We're using this one for triaging in mass casualty incidents. So you first do your respiration, followed by your checking of your perfusion, and lastly, your mental status. Okay? This would be in a pre-hospital setting. So let's have an exercise here for the victim one. Um, you were released or deployed rather in a mass casualty incident. Your first patient had a bruising all over your abdomen, all over the abdomen, complaining of abdominal pain. You've gathered the following: respiratory rate more than 30, CRT less than 2 seconds, and the patient is confused. So would this be a red, yellow, green, or black? So your answer would be, so the patient is red and the patient needs to be extricated and moved out of the way and into a safer place, no, for your acute management of the injuries. How about for victim number two? You approach another patient in a mass casualty, sudden onset of chest pain, shortness of breath, RR of less than 30, capillary refill less than 2, awake and follow command. So this would be tagged as yellow. Okay? Tagged as yellow. For victim number three, no visible wounds, respiration none, open airway still none, radial pulse absent, and the patient is conscious. Well, very obvious that the patient is tagged as black. And lastly, ablations For a patient with abrasions on the upper extremities, respiratory rate less than 30, you have a pulse, can follow command and ambulatory. So this would be tagged as green. Okay. So what you can do, this is the Google map of our hospital in Bataan General Hospital. So what we did was, in terms of receiving your victims or your casualties, you can tag your emergency room as red because in terms of logistics, in terms of medicines, emergency supplies, in terms of manpower, now the emergency room can provide all of that. For the outpatient, that's a very good setting for treating your green. And for your wards, you can actually put there your yellow patients, yellow tag patients. Okay, so in terms of the skills, we are in a way expected to have good planning skills, to participate effectively in a team, to communicate well as to provide the following. No? If we have been fortunate enough to be trained by our own or respective institutions, basic life support, advanced cardiac life, advanced trauma, neonatal resuscitation program, and your pediatric advanced life support, as well as some of the institutions, particularly in the government, would receive training in terms of delivery of your psychological first aid. So how do we now capacitate your family physician in terms of disaster risk reduction? So just a review, no? I will not dwell into the intricacies of provision of these skills, knowledge and skills. So in terms of basic life support, that's the foundation for saving lives after cardiac arrest. It's the provision of providing high quality CPR for victims of all ages. It even teaches us on how um, to use an automated external defibrillator, an AED. And aside from your CPR, it also um, teaches the responder on what to do in terms or in cases of foreign body airway obstruction. For ACLS, BLS is a prerequisite. Plus, this time you have an equipment and techniques for maintaining ventilation and circulation. So it's expected for a responder trained in ACLS to detect and to identify in terms of ECG monitoring, recognize your arrhythmias. Is this tachycardia? Is this bradycardia? Establishment of your IV, intubation, or advanced airway, post cardiac arrest care, in terms of providing hypothermia, therapeutic hypothermia, and treatment for patients with suspected ACS and stroke. For PALS, it teaches the provider an approach for caring a seriously ill or injured child. So, if you are trained in PALS, you are able to develop a plan of care for those suffering from respiratory distress. Is this a respiratory distress or is this respiratory failure? What to do in terms of shock, and how to provide your life-saving interventions. For advanced trauma life support or ATLS, we are taught in terms of assessing a patient's condition in a very fast and accurate manner, resuscitate and stabilize patients according to priority. We are then, in a way, after providing your interventions, are we going to transfer it in a higher facility or admit it in our hospital? If the hospital is not capable to provide care for that patient, are we ready for inter-hospital transfer? No, so ATLS ensures that optimal care is provided. No, and that the level of care does not deteriorate at any point during the evaluation, resuscitation, or even your transfer processes. So the ATLS for the Philippines, the Philippine College of Surgeons is the one providing your advanced trauma support. No other accredited body or training is certified now for the Philippines. Only the Philippine College of Surgeons, or your PCS, is accredited in providing certifications for ATLS. And there are even applications or apps which you can download. However, you need to either be enrolled or to purchase the handbook so that you can access your quick companion here for the ATLS. So just to provide you other resources in terms of disaster medicine, these are just websites. So you can check out ATLS, AHA, yeah, even the yeah. So these are just some additional information if you'd like for training and the practice of your disaster. Okay, so we now go to your incident command system. So these are actually senior family medicine residents. No, we do tabletop exercises in terms of what to do in case of, let's say, an earthquake, and how are we going to about your identifying your staff and to um, apply the different actions for the staff involved in your incident command system. So ICS, it's a standard on-scene, all-hazard incident management concept used by your response groups. It allows an integrated organizational structure to match the complexities and demands of a single or multiple incident. So we have the following objectives or purposes. One is to, well, make sure the safety of responders is always at mind. Achievement of your incident action plan or your tactical objectives, and to identify and use efficient use of your logistics and your resources. So this would be a very good organogram in terms of your basic incident command system structure. So you have your incident commander as the one leading your response, and under him or her, you have your liaison officer, your PIO, your safety security officer, and even below that, you have your operations planning, logistics, and your administrative or finance. So for the ICS, it comprises two major components. You have your command staff and your general staff. For the command staff, they would consist of the following: the incident commander, the PIO, and the liaison officer, and your safety and your security officer. So for the incident commander or the IC, that's the higher ranking person who assumes command, maintain command, or even transfer it to his or her deputy. A lower ranking can actually assume as IC, but more qualified may be designated as your incident commander, particularly if that person has had received training in terms of the incident command system. performs all major ICS command and staff responsibilities unless your functions are delegated and assigned. So the incident commanders, that's the first person on the scene with communication capability, either through the use of your mobile radios or your cell phones. Remains in command until it is transferred to a person who is either qualified or capable. He must have a complete authority and responsibility in terms of your disaster response. And he's also responsible in terms of evaluating the incident, identifying the resources on hand, and even make additional requests for resources and to establish your incident action plan together with your planning officer. So the roles of the incident commander, basically he or she is the overall leader for the response, delegates authority to others, takes general direction from agency, administrator, or official. We can call that official as the RO or the responsible officer or the responsible official. The IC can also assist need for additional staff. Again, establish the incident objectives together with your planning officer. And yeah, to develop your IAP or what we call as your incident action plan. Additional responsibilities is to provide safety for all of the healthcare workers who are deployed in that incident and to provide information and to establish and maintain liaison with other agencies participating in the incident. So it's a bit complex because you have different agencies. You have your Bureau of Fire, you have your PNP, you have Department of Health, plus you have your LGU. So it is systematic and it's a multi-agency response when you're talking about your incident command system. How about your deputy incident commander? Perform specific tasks as requested by the IC. The deputy can perform IC function in a relief capacity and represent the agency that shares your jurisdiction. So again, you have your command staff and your general staff. For the public information officer, this one for the general staff, anything that is relayed to the media or to the public must pass through your public information officer. So in a way, he or she is the spokesperson for that involved incident. But of course, there must be an approval from the incident commander in terms of the content of your information or when he or she is going to address the public. For the safety officer, he or she is responsible for any measures with regard to incident safety. So he or she must ensure the safety of your field personnel and the safety of all incident personnel. For the liaison, he or she would assist your IC and serve as a point of contact for agency representatives who are helping to support your operations. No? Because the first one to go or to arrive in a certain incident are usually from the Bureau of Fire, the Philippine National Police, Then you have your Department of Health and your local government units. Usually, a day after or a few hours after, you can have other agencies such as non-government organizations or even your Department of Social Welfare and Development would pitch in to help with the operations. So the general staff would include the following, no? Planning, operations, planning section chief, operations section chief, logistics chief, and your finance or administration chief. So for planning, the function of your planning section officer or section chief is to collect, evaluate, disseminate, use information about development of your incident and status of your resources. Responsibility is mainly to create, together with your incident commander, your incident action plan, defining your response activities, as well as an inventory of your resources and how you're going to utilize it for a specified time period. Very important is your operations section chief. This would be the one who is going to execute all that is contained in your incident action plan, coordinates with the activities and responsible rather for receiving and implementing your incident action plan. Directly reports to your IC and determines the required resources. Does the operations require certain supplies, medicines, or does the operations require even manpower for your for the rescue? No? Organizational structure within your operations section. So it's under the direction of your IC, your operations section chief, deploys tactics to control and resolve your incident, and again responsible for the execution and implementation of your IAP. The operations section chief makes recommendations for changes to plan based on your incident status and is in direct contact with your staging officer. The staging officer is under your operations section chief, who is responsible for the safekeeping of, let's say, ambulances, fire trucks, and other rescue vehicles, as well as the different logistical needs for the operations. So task supervisors to report to operations, not to your incident commander. Then we have your logistics section chief, responsible for the provision of your facilities, where would the responders would stay if the deployment would be in a prolonged period, services, materials, including personnel to operate for the incident. Significance in terms of long-term or extended operations. And lastly, your finance or administration section. This is responsible for tracking your costs and reimbursement, accounting. So it's very important because whatever the cost would have, it would depend if that incident would be declared as a if that incident would be declared as a magnitude equal to a national emergency. So very important you to have or to know your 6-step response. So let's say you're in an ER and you're the senior house officer or the senior resident responsible for the operations of the emergency room. You've received a call involving multiple vehicular collisions involving a lot of um, uh, people were injured. So what would you do? You just follow your six-step response. First is, well, you have to assume command. So either talk among the duty group, or since you're the senior house officer, you can assume command as your incident commander, followed by assessing your situation. You can ask the different responders. You can ask your command center how many are injured in that area, or where are they going to distribute these um, patients who have had different kinds of injuries. Identify and set perimeters so you can deploy your security officer and to identify um, on where the patients would come in, uh, where the patients would go out after treatment. So you have to identify and set your perimeters. Your command post, if you're at the emergency room can serve as your command post, or even an area near the ER wherein you can visualize and see the incoming patients with different types of your physical injuries. Assign a safety officer. This can be in the person of your um, person responsible for security, and establish a staging area, and even assign a staging officer so that in terms of operations, you can deploy them to provide treatment for the multiple patients who would come in with a lot of injuries. Case, a bit of an exercise. We have a case scenario here. Let's say the bus with 40 passengers collided with a car with 3 passengers along the highway. So the car was pushed several meters away from the collision site while the bus was turned over on its side. The incident caused heavy traffic as far as 2 kilometers away from the site. There were undetermined number of casualties. So assuming there are no other threats on the scene of the accident, the first to respond was an ambulance consisting of one doctor and 2 paramedics. So how are you going to do first your organogram, keeping in mind your incident command system? So let's see. So since you have a doctor and you have 2 paramedics as the first to respond in that area, doctor can assume your incident commander. And in terms of operations, you can delegate your the work, the first paramedic in terms of rescue and triage, and to the second paramedic as responsible for treatment and transport. Okay, so let's complicate the matter a little bit. Still with the current scenario, about the same time, a police car. You now have 2 additional police officers, followed by another ambulance team with 2 paramedics. So your task is to form another structured organization, taking into account the 2 police officers and paramedics. So how will your structure be? Using your incident command system. So you can do like this one. No? You can still assume as the incident commander. Distribute now your paramedics into rescue, triage, treatment, and transport, and delegate your crowd control and traffic management to the police officers who came to the sites. Okay, this is just to show you what the organizational chart for a hospital emergency incident command system. So the director is or would be your responsible official. So this is a typical example of an after 5 o'clock or an after office hour organization. So the senior house officer can assume as the incident commander. We've delegated the OB as the public information officer, the engineering staff as the safety officer, family medicine because we have good communication skills. So that's the reason why we put there as the liaison officer. The pediatrics on duty as logistics chief, senior internal med as the planning. The surgeon would be involved in operations, the ER med in terms of treatment, senior billing as for the finance, and even the pathologists and radiologists you can mobilize in terms of intelligence or for investigation. So one of those exercises is for you. You can do um, a tabletop exercise, and yes, being the incident commander, you can explain there where to place your media or your press in terms of what to do with the flow of your traffic, when where to put your logistics, your ambulances, even your fire trucks. So this is a good example of applying no, as a tabletop exercise for your incident command system. Okay, lastly is how to prepare for the big one. So what is our role as family physicians in terms of preparedness and response? So this would be the movement of your West Valley faults. You know, so we've done this during or in one of our annual convention. Actually, surgeons from the Philippine College of Surgeons um, had volunteered no, to teach the family physicians on how to stop the bleed for bleeding injuries. How about for office-based family physicians? No? So you can also download this one from the AAFP. It's a practical guide for emergency preparedness for office-based family physicians. So it teaches us that it's really a cycle, no, on how to go about your emergency preparedness. No, to have an inventory, and then you can do your mock drill, and then you can also orient your staff and do evaluation if you're capable, let's say, of handling an acute asthma attack in your clinic. No? So what to do in cases of emergencies presenting at the clinic. So it even um, had discussed there the inventory or in terms of investing um, some medicines as well as some equipment for your office to be prepared for emergencies. So these are just examples. Even the cost is listed here. So the big one is basically the movement of your West Valley Fault involving your the following cities, no? Quezon, Marikina, Pasig, Makati, Pateros, Taguig, and Muntinlupa. So what are the hazards that can happen? Ground rupture, shaking, even liquefaction, landslides, and even the occurrence of fire. That's the reason why there's a plan that was developed called the Metro Manila Earthquake Contingency Plan. That's the Oplan Metro Yakal Plus. The latest is your 2015. If you can see here, they've actually um, divided into four quadrants, you know, and divided into north, south, east, and west quadrants. So, what is the impact of your 7.2 magnitude earthquake? You're expected to have immediately fatalities of about 30,000 persons. And these are other quantifiable effects of your 7.2 magnitude earthquake. And these are the quadrants that were used to separate the cities. No? There were north, east, west, and south quadrants. And the reason why they made this one is because they're expecting that the bridges connecting these cities would fall down. Rather, so would fall down because of that earthquake. So that is the reason why they've cut off and distributed these four quadrants. So these are the identified camps and the emergency field hospitals in terms of where you are if and when the big one would happen. So how would you as a family physician would enter and participate, no? So here for the agency and the groups, you have your other volunteer organizations, civil society. We can participate in terms of humanitarian assistance or even in the disaster response. As for the apps available, you can also download the Project NOAA, and it's a very good tool in terms of identifying if there are typhoons, no, or even monsoons that will come in to the area of responsibility of our country. You can also download an app. It's Fault Finder, and you can actually enter your address and locate, no, what are the nearest faults in your either in your residence or in your practice. Okay, so that will be my last slide for today. And thank you for listening. I do hope that you got a lot of ideas, you know, and for the practice of disaster preparedness for family physicians. So thank you for listening and good luck on your examinations.